One more time, we will continue on. Maybe one more time. We might break this out into two parts, but I want to get through and wrap up this particular chapter before it goes on for way too long. As we've already been going through, we've covered bottom-up processing, and we saw how bottom-up processing can be particularly useful as an explanation for what is sometimes called early vision, meaning the earliest stages of visual processing, taking us from the receptors in the eye back to some lower level brain processes, mainly to what are called the simple cells and complex cells in primary visual cortex, or V1. But it doesn't seem to tell the whole story about object recognition, being able to perceive a three-dimensional object. And so we may need to now switch over and invoke top-down processing to see if maybe this holds some degree of promise to help explain how this could work here. And the main top-down theory that we're going to look at and focus on is called the theory of unconscious inference, and it comes from Hermann von Helmholtz way back in the 1800s. And even though this theory is about 150 years old, uh, it's worth noting that it remains a very kind of central idea in how we understand perception working. There are some modern ideas that I have actually in the notes a little bit later on, but these ideas are essentially just modernized extensions or adaptations of Helmholtz's work. They are not outright changes or replacements to what's going on here. So I think we can stick with Helmholtz, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of those modern interpretations here. So as I had defined bottom up as a data-driven process where we're only going to use the data coming from the sensations to try to extract a meaning from all of that, a top-down process uses information then from beyond that sensory data. What do I mean by beyond the sensory data? Here we're talking about prior experiences potentially, right? So that's knowledge that I already have. Certainly, those prior experiences were previously a form of sensory data, right? I had an experience in the past that was sensory, and then I store it as a memory. And so, of course, the origin of all of that knowledge is sensory, and it's in the beginning. But the idea here is that when I am looking at one thing right now, the data of that current sensation is not enough to help me recognize what it is. I need something from past to help me out here a little bit, right? And so it's that kind of stored knowledge that we call top down because it goes beyond the current sensations that we are experiencing right at this moment. Of course, there are other forms of top-down information. There could be forms of context about the situation that we're in, and that might give me certain expectations. That's one of the newer things. And maybe even we could invoke innate knowledge, although it's not a very popular choice in modern psychology to do so, but absolutely, in the history of thinking about this kind of stuff, innate knowledge has been invoked to explain how we're able to interpret the incoming sensory data. So again, the challenge is the same as we've defined before. We are given a current scene, that is, we're looking at something. It's a scene, it's a place, it's an event, it's an object. And the sensory data, we can process some of the early stages, but we still need to interpret and understand what it is we are looking at. And we're going to use, according to Helmholtz's prior experience, to do this. So let's try this scene. So simple enough. Here we are standing on a railroad track, looking down the rails, which we, of course, should not do, right? Now, if I were to ask a person to describe what this place is, what it looks like, what's going on, maybe to describe the railroad tracks themselves. What they're going to say is, let's say we're actually standing there, right? So they're going to say, well, the rails are parallel to each other and they are receding away in the distance. And the railroad ties are lined up parallel to each other but perpendicular to the rails. And those are equally spaced, and they are also receding away in the distance. And likewise, there's some gravel on the side of the railroad track, and it's also receding away along with the rails. There's grass and trees at various locations and distances all around me. And that's not wrong in any sense to describe this scene exactly like that. But one of the important things, and we mentioned this a little bit earlier in the notes here, is that this is a photograph. And as a photograph being displayed on your screen, it is flat. It is two-dimensional. So the depth technically is not there. And importantly, if you were really standing on the railroad tracks as if this was, you were really there, the same thing would be true for your visual input, right? The three-dimensional world that surrounds us here is projected by the lens of our eyes into a two-dimensional image projected to the retina inside of the eyeball. So when the rods and cones go to work on the light rays that are projected into the eye, they are extracting information from this two-dimensional projection inside of the eyeball. So the beginnings of vision are not too terribly different from a geometric perspective, at least from this two-dimensional photograph. And the point of that is that this means that if I were to say, let me give an alternative description of this scene. So what if I were to say that the rails are not parallel, but they are converging to a point, and they go up until about the middle of the image, and then they come to a point and they stop right there. And that the railroad ties are not equally spaced, but they get closer and closer to each other the further up towards the middle of the image that they go. And they also get shorter. That seems like an odd way to describe what's happening in this image, but from a two-dimensional perspective, from the image itself, a geometric perspective, that is entirely valid. And so what we might say is that there are two equally valid ways to interpret this scene. It could be a two-dimensional scene described as I just did, or it could be a three-dimensional scene described as I said earlier. Which one of those two is the correct interpretation, though, is the question. And this is where Helmholtz comes in and says, all right, the visual system is going to be given information like this. It may have some degree of ambiguity, and we're going to need to infer the most likely candidate interpretation. And so when faced with a choice such as, is the 2D interpretation a likely candidate, or is the 3D interpretation a likely candidate? Well, one possibility is for our brains to consult past experience, to think about situations where we had been in a scene, maybe if we were never here in this one place before, standing on the railroad tracks, maybe we were somewhere else standing on railroad tracks and we saw something similar, right? Or again, since we shouldn't be doing such things, maybe we were standing on a sidewalk that has a similar kind of geometric pattern here, which in art we call linear perspective, and also there's a texture gradient here too. So if you were to consult any past experiences with similar kinds of visual scenes, and you say, okay, well, in those past environments, anytime I encountered any kind of thing that looks like this, that looks like linear perspective, I was able to understand back then that that was really a three-dimensional place. So now that I know that from my past, I'm going to use that knowledge right now to interpret this current scene as three-dimensional, right? And so the idea is that this is a process that is a form of inference, right? We're making a choice between two interpretations of the same image. And again, we're going to pick the one we think is most likely. So it's an educated guess, right? And that's kind of what an inference is. But on top of that, it's also called the theory of unconscious inference because, as you would hopefully imagine, we don't do this sort of stuff deliberatively, right? We don't stand around thinking, oh, how am I going to interpret the world around me right now, right? It just happens very, very quickly. practically automatically, we might think, but the idea is that there is this very quick and implicit unconscious consultation of past knowledge that's continuously directing us towards what is hopefully the most correct interpretation. But that's, of course, the question here is, does it always work? Is it possible that we might sometimes make incorrect interpretations? And the answer is, well, maybe, right? But of course, we already know that because that's what illusions are, potentially, right? So, we've got the infamous dress photograph here on the right. People will experience it as different colors. What's weird is the fact that different people see it as different colors. But what's happening potentially here, I don't know that I favor this explanation, but to stick with the Helmholtzian approach, just for the sake of being consistent with the concept we're trying to explain, um, is that different people might have different experiences with these color ratios, and because of those individual differences in experience, they perceptually interpret the image differently, and so people then argue about what color the dress really is. Another example, I think one that works a whole lot better, is in the bottom left, right? The two horizontal lines, the blue line and the red line. You've probably seen this before if you're a psych student. This is the Mueller-Lyer illusion. And as you probably know, the blue line and the red line are exactly the same length. But if we show this kind of stimulus to a naive research participant, they will consistently report the blue line is longer. And one explanation, one that it fits with unconscious inference, is that these two lines look sort of like the inside or outside of a cornered building, right? So if you think about being inside of a room, it might be useful to try to mentally flip this image to the vertical. But think about being in a square room and what the corner looks like, where the corner of the walls meets the floor and meets the ceiling. Those intersections form these kind of inverted arrowheads like on the blue line. And meanwhile, if you were outside of a square building and you were looking at the outside vertex of two walls meeting and where those walls meet the ground and maybe some surface above, you would see these inward turned arrowheads as in the red line. And so the idea here is that when you're looking at the blue line, you're kind of invoking this kind of past experience with an internal corner, which is a concave intersection. And meanwhile, if you're looking at the red line, you're also looking at a pattern that is similar to your past experiences, looking at a more convex intersection here. And it looks like it's kind of jutting out at you a little bit. And so this invokes differences in depth perception, and the red one looks closer than the blue one looks farther away. And then the argument is that if you have two things that project the exact same retinal image size, but one is closer and the other is further, then the further one must be a little larger. And that's the claim, right? So the argument here is that because of past experience, looking at rectangular buildings with right-angled walls, that influences how we make sense out of that image. To try to justify that, researchers back in the mid 20th century presented illusions like this to people from all around the world, traveling to very remote areas and asking them if they judged the blue line or red line as longer or anything like that. And what they found, and this was particularly true in more remote places where they don't build a lot of buildings with right angles, and the argument being that right angles don't happen very often in nature, so they don't have a lot of experience seeing that kind of imagery that I described about the inside and outside of square buildings. They were not prone to the illusion, was the claim. And so now the suggestion is that those kinds of individual differences or cultural differences in that case in visual experience influence our susceptibility to these illusions. In the middle, we have what's it called the cafe tile illusion, I think. And so the idea is that all of those horizontal lines going across the scene are in fact perfectly horizontal and parallel to each other, but we get this sense of everything being kind of like wobbly and all that sort of stuff, right? And that's again a case where, despite the fact that at the level of the bottom-up process, this is where the distinction between bottom-up and top-down can be really useful. Also true for the Mueller-Lyer. is that in terms of the activity of the rods and the cones, the lines projected to the eye are in fact horizontal. In terms of the activation of the simple cells, which might have horizontal line orientation preferences, those will all be activated because geometrically, yes, those are horizontal lines. But despite all of that low-level activation suggesting that we're looking at horizontal lines at a higher level, perceptual level, we don't see that at all, right? We see something very, very different. So again, suggests that there's some kind of something else that's affecting or influencing how we perceive this beyond just what's the kind of data that's given to the eyes. And last over here is an example of a brightness illusion of sorts, if you will. So there are you got a checkerboard here, got the little green cylinder sitting on it, casting a shadow across the board. And what we typically do in this is we have two tiles on the checkerboard labeled A and B, and we will ask people to determine whether or not the tiles A and B are the same level of brightness or gray, or is one darker than or lighter than the other. It's kind of like a shading version of the Mueller-Lyer. Are they the same or are they different? And people, of course, consistently report that square A is dark and square B is light. But if we were to look at the exact gray level values here, if we could kind of just zero in on those individual squares, we would see that the gray values are identical to each other. And that's because the shadow being cast over the B square by that cylinder darkens that B square a little bit so that it is in fact of equal brightness as the A square. But we don't see it that way. So again, despite the actual brightness levels given to the eye, the higher level perceptual response is influenced by other information beyond the data. So as I described it here, perception is about this kind of inference, right? And one way to think about it is that it is a statistical process. And I think I might have mentioned this before, that the idea that the sensory data itself is equivalent to descriptive statistics. But in order to go from sensation to perception, we have to invoke something that's equivalent to inferential statistics, where when you perform an inferential statistical test, as you learn in your stats classes, what you end up with is a p-value, right? So you don't end up with some sort of absolute statement of certainty. If you do an experiment with two groups and you run a t-test and you get p less than 0.05, that is not a conclusion of absolute certainty that your conclusion about your data is true, but rather it simply just suggests that there's some sort of probabilistic reason that you can accept your conclusion as likely anyway. And that's a bit of an oversimplification of the stats reasoning there, but it's good enough for us. And so the argument holds true here is that because we're performing a type of inference, that means that I am not necessarily always absolutely strictly true, but hopefully my process is good enough to be true most of the time, minimizing what we call type 1 errors or type 2 errors. Again, I'm invoking stats class stuff. If you've not had stats, maybe don't worry about it. Right, but that's what we want to avoid. We want to avoid perceptual errors, right? False positives and false negatives are what those refer to. But it's important here that we understand this as something of a probabilistic kind of process here. And one way to think about this is to think about Bayesian reasoning here. So another concept that you'll get in a stats course, or if you take a probability course, is Bayes' theorem. And just to unpack this a little bit, I'm going to jump ahead. I'll come back to the slide, but I'm going to jump ahead to this image that shows Bayes' theorem. So it's a complex looking equation, but it's not too terribly difficult. And we don't need to really deep dive into the proof of this and why it's true anyway. But we have some p values here, p, probability, right? And then we have some variables a and b. And it doesn't necessarily matter what A and B are, at least for this immediate purpose. I'll explain maybe how we can apply this to perception here at the bottom. But that little vertical line between A and B basically means given, right? Or if. So it's basically saying what's the probability of A given B, right? And so if given that B is happening, given that we have information about B is happening, what's the probability that A is also happening? We like to use true and false here a little bit, right? So if B is true, what is the probability of A being true? Or to frame it as it's written there in green, what's the probability of A given B? This is called a posterior probability, but let's not talk about what the posterior probability means just quite yet. One of the things that we need to think about here is what factors into this. And let's first look at the numerator of the equation. In orange, we have the likelihood, probability of B given A. So what's the likelihood of B happening essentially, right? The prior probability is the probability of A happening in the first place, and so that's shown there in teal. And then the denominator is the probability of B being true in the denominator. So we're going to scale everything by the overall probability that B is true. And this equation, this relationship, can help us calculate the posterior probability. So the prior probability we see is the probability of A, but we want to know what's the probability of A given we know something about B, and that's called the posterior probability. Let's turn this into a perceptual question. So we're going to replace A with some object in the world, like a tree. We used that in the previous diagram, right? B is a particular sensory pattern that we are receiving. That could be some light rays that have some brown and green and other stuff, right? So I want to know what is the probability that I'm looking at a tree given this particular sensory pattern that my eyes are presented with right now. So A is my judgment that there is a tree, and B is the current sensory data. So the likelihood is kind of the flip of that, right? It's the likelihood that if there was a tree present in the world, that would give us the sensory pattern we have right now. So that's what the probability of B given A means, is what's the likelihood that that tree could generate this particular, that a tree, any tree, could generate this particular sensory pattern, right? So that's the probability of B given A, the orange part of the numerator. The probability of A being true is my prior probability or my expectation. What's the likelihood that I would even see a tree in this situation? If I'm in the middle of the Arctic or in a very urban city, maybe the probability of encountering a tree is low. But if I'm in the middle of a forest, the probability of encountering a tree is high. So these kinds of this kind of situational knowledge is going to affect those prior probabilities, right? The more likely I'm in a situation where I expect there to be trees, my priors are going to be high, and otherwise my priors are going to be low. And then what's this denominator all about? The probability of that sensory pattern B being true? Well, we have to accept the possibility that there could be noise in our sensory signals, and so there might be some distortion so that what my eyes are doing is noisy and doesn't necessarily faithfully reflect the actual proximal stimulus or distal stimulus. And so we might want to think of this roughly, and I want to emphasize very roughly, as a ratio that reflects kind of a signal to noise ratio, right? The signal to noise meaning the signal is the thing I want to detect versus the noise of random neural firing and the fact that my eyes are just not perfect, right? And so once we factor all of this into account, we take in our prior expectations of what's the probability I might encounter a tree, what's the likelihood that trees would create this sensory pattern, and I account for all of the background noise in my visual system, then I can calculate the final posterior probability that yes, I think I'm looking at a tree. So then the idea is that every time we are perceiving this kind of implicit Bayesian statistical process is happening, so that maybe I have several different candidates for what is it that I'm looking at, right? Could be a tree, it could be something else. So I might evaluate the posterior probability of a tree and compare that to the posterior probability of some other thing. Maybe that other thing is a car, two very different kind of judgments, right? And so in one case, the probability of encountering a tree in the forest is high. The prior probability of encountering a tree in an urban environment is low. But if it's a car, those priors flip. those influence then our calculations of posterior. Of course, likelihoods are going to be very different. The fact that the question of whether or not a car could generate the same kind of sensory pattern that a tree would is like not likely to happen. So that's going to affect the other half of that numerator, right? So one way or another, there's going to be one candidate that ends up getting the highest posterior probability, and that's the thing that comes back to previous slide here that says that's the answer, right? That's what we're looking at because it won the highest probability. Now, what about Friston here? So maybe I'll just kind of keep this at a fairly simple level here. So Carl Friston's work is pretty important these days, and he's getting at something that is very similar to this kind of Bayesian prediction kind of um, idea here. I didn't say much about prediction when I talked about Bayes' theorem, so let me talk about it because it's relevant to Friston as well. So what's happening here is that according to Friston, we are always in a constant state of uncertainty, right? That is, I'm uncertain about what's going on in the outside world around me. And I build this internal mental model or mental representation of the world. And that one of the ways in which I could try to evaluate whether or not this mental model or mental interpretation or mental representation of the world is true or not is separate from what Helmholtz said about consulting my past experience is simply to test it. And how do I test it? By doing something, right? So if I predict that based on the scene I see before me now, that my glasses are sitting on the table in front of me within reach distance, and that's what my mental model of the world is right now, then it would surely make sense for me to just reach out there, exerting a modest degree of physical effort, and I should be able to pick them up, no problem. So the fact that I was successfully able to do this because I could tell that the glasses were within reach distance is not surprising, right? It was completely an expected outcome. And that's what Friston is talking about here, is that we want to always try to generate these kinds of mental models so that every single thing we do on a moment-to-moment basis does not create surprise, right? So what if, for example, we're back in that situation where to me it looks like my glasses are right in front of me and I could reach out and grab them. But as soon as I try to do that, suddenly I notice that my hand just can't get there. It's like, wait a minute, why are they out of reach? I can't, it looks like they should be right there, but they're really out of reach. That would be a very odd kind of perceptual experience to be having. Though maybe under the influence of a hallucinogen, such things might happen. Or maybe what might happen is that in the experience of some sort of psychosis kind of situation, um, such experiences might happen. And so what Friston is arguing here is that in those kinds of situations, our mental models have become distorted so that they are no longer generating a kind of a no surprise kind of an event, right? Once everything, if that's what happens here, if my mental models were so inaccurate that I couldn't make sense out of the world anymore. Everything that I do would suddenly be surprising and weird, and I was like, "What's going on?" Everything seems odd and foreign and chaotic to me now because I think this is what's happening, but every time I try to interact with it, something weird and unexpected happens, and so I'm always generating surprisal. And that's what Friston refers to here as free energy, because what he's talking about here is a concept that comes from Shannon's information theory that we covered in the first chapter. And the idea is that we can calculate what's called information theoretic free energy. And here, the concept of free energy refers to another related idea called information entropy, which is just variation and uncertainty in our current informational states, right? So that's what I was talking about with uncertainty a minute ago. So we want to minimize uncertainty and we want to minimize information theoretic free energy, but that means minimizing prediction errors and surprise. I want everything to make sense. I want to be able to reach out and pick something up because that's what I expected. So as long as I'm able to maintain a coherent perceptual reality where everything makes sense on a moment-to-moment basis and I'm not getting surprised and weirded out by odd things happening, then my consciousness stays completely within the limits of normality and everything is cool, right? But on the other hand, if this didn't work anymore, if something happened to cause a breakdown, then our conscious experience would, as I wrote here, devolve into hallucinatory chaos. We would go crazy, right? And that's what Friston, Friston's working from a psychiatric background, so he's probably thinking in those terms, but he's developed here essentially an information theoretic version of the Helmholtzian theory, right? To suggest that we piece together probabilistically and based on past experiences our best possible mental model of reality. And as long as it continues to work moment to moment, because there's no surprises, I can keep maintaining this view of reality, and hopefully nothing ever goes wrong and makes things break down, right? Earlier in the previous video, I mentioned template matching. So I do have that here another example of top-down processing. This is a bit distinct from Helmholtzian and Bayesian and free energy views here. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on it since we already covered it a little bit previously. But the idea is that we have to have a stored mental picture of everything that we could recognize. And so that way, if I'm looking at a coffee mug was the previous example, then um, what are all of the possible gray level arrays or sensory patterns that a coffee mug might generate? And if I have all of those stored, then whenever I look at a coffee mug, I can simply just match the current sensory image to all of these stored images. And when I find the match, I'll be able to say, yep, that's a coffee mug. Or no, it's not a coffee mug. It must be something else. So I better keep sorting until I find a template that matches what I'm looking at now. As I mentioned before, this is a problem that might be intractable from a computational perspective. Um, so the idea, if I just have to start sorting through possibilities one at a time, how many comparisons do I make? Is it 5, 10? Well, no, more likely, the total number of things that I know about in my mind and the total number of possible variations of those things, different kinds of coffee cups or dogs, and also different viewpoints and perspectives I have on them, whether I'm standing above or to the side, right? Um, is a really, really large amount of variation here. So it might take not even hundreds or thousands, it might take millions or if not billions and trillions of comparisons before I finally sort through this long list of images stored as templates in my mind until that match is found. And so if we do this one at a time, that's called serial processing, important cognitive term here. And we say that this is a problem known as an NP-complete problem. And what this means, NP refers to non-polynomial time. And I don't necessarily want to get into computational theory here, but what we will say, as I wrote it here as computationally intractable, is that there's no known way to solve this problem in any reasonable amount of time. There could be more time left. It might take more time to sort through all of these comparisons than there's even time left in the universe. So the argument is that that's not a satisfactory way to explain how perception works. Now we can speed it up, and we know that brains can do a lot of things much more faster and efficiently than computers can do. And one way is that maybe we can have what's called parallel processing. And what parallel processing does is it means that we don't have to just make one comparison at a time over and over again in a series, but rather we can maybe make multiple comparisons all at the same time and simultaneously evaluate many possible alternatives. So that reduces it increases the total number of comparisons we make at any one given time, but that would reduce the total amount of time it would take to find a match. But it's unclear that we can increase the total number of parallel processes to such a degree that we would speed this up to make it happen nearly instantaneously the way object recognition actually works in reality. One possible way to fix this is to try to reduce the number of templates. Instead of having billions or trillions of these things that we have to sort through, maybe what we could try to do is define objects by simplified structural representations. And so One example is called the Geon theory. And what we're doing here is we're going to suggest that objects can be represented in some sort of kind of idealistic way as a set of specific types of geometric shapes. So, for example, we have a list on the bottom right of different kinds of geons, some cylinders and these horn-shaped shapes or a wedge shape. And then the argument is that all objects, in this case, whether it's a coffee mug or a briefcase or a pail with a handle, uh, could be captured by this smaller set of geons. So now all that has to happen is that I have to match um, the geometric properties of the object, their geons, to a smaller set of geons. On the left, we see an example of taking a geon type approach to the human body as a set of nested cylinders. But whether that is really possible, that it's truly possible that we could actually represent all kinds of objects, every object that's recognizable, as geons, it's not clear that that's in fact true, right? So this may or may not help out a little bit, but it certainly is a popular approach here. So let's kind of wrap up our thoughts on top-down processing here. So there's plenty of reason to argue that yes, top-down processing is happening, right? We, as I've described with some of the illusions, whether it's individual differences or cultural differences, any differences in experience uh, could likely have an impact on how someone perceives the world. The illusions suggest that there's something happening beyond just the geometry of the sensory image itself, beyond the stimulus, that is affecting our perception. And so that would again suggest that there's some kind of other internal process at work that influences how we perceive. And it might also kind of help us out a little bit to think about a particular clinical issue called agnosia. So what's happening here is that if you have certain kinds of damaged lesions to regions of the temporal lobe, this results in a form of neural impairment called agnosia, which is a recognition impairment. You have difficulty recognizing and naming objects. But one of the things that we see with agnosia is that it is sometimes category specific. There's a famous version called prosopagnosia that only affects face perception, but doesn't affect other kinds of objects. And then there might be others that are more geometric in nature. So the idea is that that provides some maybe neurophysiological evidence that different kinds of objects are represented in different parts of the brain, suggesting that there's some sort of internal template geon type representational system there that can, selectively be damaged and affect only recognition of one kind of an object, right? But let's talk about some problems here. As I kind of already suggested here, it may or may not be valid to suggest that every kind of recognizable object in the world could be reduced to some set of geons. There's always the question of how do we manage to make sense out of a novel object that we've never seen before if we don't have any stored representations for what this thing is. It doesn't explain learning, right? So whether we have templates or geon structural descriptions or any of this kind of other experience, um, that the answer to the question of how perception work is always kind of pushed into the past. And that's the problem of infinite regress in the next, right? So let me explain that maybe with Helmholtz, right? So go back to that photo of the railroad tracks. And what I said is that if you, in order to make an interpretation of that scene, you're going to consult some past experiences with similar scenes. That gives you the hint, oh, I should interpret this as a three-dimensional place. But one of the things that you might be concerned about here is to think, oh, well, what about that previous experience that I'm thinking about? Even if it's unconscious, that previous experience is in there. And so I might ask, well, how did I correctly perceive that previous place as a three-dimensional place when I was having that experience in the past? And the answer, as far as Helmholtzian theory goes, is that, well, you had some prior experience even then. And I'm like, okay, well, then what about that previous experience? How did I make sense of it then? And again, the answer just is, well, still, you had some past experience before that. So what's happening here is that we're always pushing the answer to how perception works into the past. right? Without ever explaining how it works. We're just saying you already know because you learned it in the past. But we can't do this forever, right? Because if we keep going back and back in time, eventually we're going to run into some sort of a block, like being born a blank slate with no innate knowledge, and then we don't have any past experience to draw upon. So how are we supposed to get going from the ground up? And I mean that literally using my analogy to bottom up processing that I described before, where you have to get going without any past experiences. So you're able to do some kind of bottom up, apparently. Uh, and then at some point later, you switch to top down. Why? If you can get going with perceptually from infancy using a bottom up process, why do you switch to top down later on? Is it better? Is it more effective? Um, well, I don't know. These are questions that need to be addressed, right? And we don't have a complete answer to any of that. Couple of other complaints about top-down research here. So you might have heard of these kinds of studies. One of the things that is a popular report going back about 25 or so years is that when people put a heavy backpack on, and you ask them to judge the steepness of a hill that they're standing next to, they tend to judge that hill as being steeper than when they are not wearing the backpack. Or if you show them an object at some distance, like you could have them out on some open ground plane and there's some object target located some distance away from them, you can have them estimate the distance. And again, while they're wearing the heavy backpack, they judge the distance to be longer. The argument here is that wearing a heavy backpack increases the amount of physical exertion that would be required for us to climb that hill or to walk that distance. And so it's essentially an implicit signal coming from our proprioceptive systems that I need to treat these things as steep or far because I know it's going to be a lot of work. Well, one of the weird things about this is that even though we can show statistically that people's judgments of distance or steepness do change, um, they don't change by a huge number, but also um, there's no phenomenal effect that happens, right? If this really happened, that the world looks farther away when you're wearing a heavy backpack, then why don't every time you strap on that heavy pack, wouldn't everything around you just suddenly kind of shrink away in the distance in some kind of weird Hitchcockian perspective shift effect? That does not happen, right? So, how do we reconcile the lack of what's called phenomenal awareness of these perceptual changes with these kinds of changes in the verbal judgments? And this is considered a top-down effect, though, because of the idea that knowledge of wearing the pack is going to influence my spatial perception of the world, right? I mentioned this, I think, earlier in the notes about the fact that this perceptual theory assumes that we have created a mental image and that all of perception is about the creation of mental imagery. So then what about people who don't have this ability? That's called aphantasia. Um, we would predict that if a person has no mental imagery ability, that they simply couldn't perceive the world if perception relies on that ability. But we have no evidence of this. In fact, right, all perceptual tests that we have show that people with aphantasia or without perform the same on any perceptual task. I've done some of this research myself, looking at reaching to targets in virtual reality and giving people feedback to improve their performance and testing them sort of before and after. But we also gave them mental imagery test on the what's called the vividness of mental imagery, and we got no results, no differences, right? That no matter how people varied on their test of vividness of mental imagery, uh, um, their performance was not predicted by that, right? One other thing to say about imagery in this case is there are some tasks that seem to rely very heavily on imagery, right? A mental rotation task. So your task in these is to judge whether or not these three-dimensional block shapes are same or different. So they might be the same shape, but because they're rotated so that they're not completely aligned with each other, you might have to do a mental rotation. That is, you have to encode a mental image of these objects and mentally rotate it in your mind so that way you can then compare them mentally. You compare their mental images so that you can then determine if they are the same. And one of the things that we find here is that both control controls who have normal imagery and aphantasic people are both accurate at this test. They can both do it. The only difference between them is the time it takes to do this, right? So one of the things that we see is that with the regular imagery control subjects, the amount of rotational difference between the two figures influences the time it takes to make your judgment. So if they're rotated in a very a high degree away from each other, it takes longer for people to perform their response, as if the act of mental rotation takes some time, right? When aphantasic patients are used, this doesn't happen, right? Also, in a mental travel task here, what happens is you study this map of an island with different objects, different places located there. And then we ask people to close their eyes and mentally imagine traveling from one landmark to another landmark, and then press a button when they have mentally traveled to that location. And what we find is that the time taken for this mental travel is always proportional to the distance that's specified in the drawing. If we ask aphantasic patients to do this, they will do it, but they don't show that same kind of timing effect. So it does suggest that while accuracy of imagery performance is essentially the same between the two groups, there are some subtle differences in the time it takes to perform some of these tasks. So what does that tell us about perception and imagery? I guess the answer is unclear. All right, one final thing here. Actually, no, let's stop here because, again, I don't want to make so many videos on this topic, but I also don't want to have these videos going on forever and ever. So the whole direct perception approach that's going to feed us into the fifth and final problem of my list of problems of perception that I started the notes with. We will make that one last video, and that will be it. Okay.